I'm going to be reading from Hand-Carved Coffins, which was one of the very first things I ever read of Truman's, which is only unusual because Truman was always, from the time I was a little kid, Truman Capote was a hovering presence in our house, particularly for my father, who the writer Dominic Dunne. He, in 1965, my father gave a black and white ball for the 10th anniversary, married to my mother. And Truman came. He was invited. My dad knew he would just get the cha-cha going and get everybody on the dance floor. And but he showed up after meticulous planning with the tables. He showed up with a cop from Kansas and his wife, Alvin Dewey. Truman, In Cold Blood had just come out, and he indeed cha-cha'd the night away, and it was a great party, and lovely note of thanks from Truman my father got. And then the following year, Truman gave his black and white ball and did not invite my father, of which used to torment him. So that's how I always knew the name. And then when La Cote Basque came out, Truman's life went into freefall at the very same period in the 70s that my father's life also went into freefall. Both were alcoholics, both had lost all their friends, their reputations, and my father went into like exile, moved to, well, he didn't move, he drove up the coast of California into Oregon until his car broke down, and he lived in a cabin to teach himself how to write, and he got sober. And when this book came out, Music for Chameleons, Truman was on a bit of an upswing. He sort of found his creativity, recovered from being an outcast, and wrote Hand-Carved Coffins. But the two men had not spoken since the black and white ball. And somehow Truman got his address in this rental cabin, and he wrote him and said, "No one knows more about shame and failure than I do, so I know why you're there. But when the time is right, that is not where you belong, and you must come back and face your world." And that inspired him to move to New York, where he hadn't lived since the 50s. And when Truman died in 1984, my father became a crime writer and found himself compared to Truman Capote. And so this is one of his great crime pieces, Hand-Carved Coffins, a nonfiction story that people can test its how it's what's fiction and what isn't, which I'm going to read. Hand-Carved Coffins, March 1975. A town in a small western state, a focus for the many large farms and cattle-raising ranches surrounding it. The town, with a population of less than 10,000, supports 12 churches and 2 restaurants. A movie house, though it was not shown a movie in 10 years, still stands stark and cheerless on Main Street. There was once a hotel, too, but that has also been closed. And nowadays, the only place a traveler can find shelter is in the Prairie Motel. The motel is clean, the rooms are well heated. That's about all you can say for it. A man named Jake Pepper has been living there for almost 5 years. He is 58, a widower with 4 grown sons. He is 5'10", in top condition, and looks 15 years younger than his age. He is handsomely homely, with a face with periwinkle blue eyes and a thin mouth that twitches into quirky shapes that are sometimes smiles and sometimes not. The secret of his boyish appearance is not his lanky trimness, nor his chunky red ripe apple cheeks, nor his naughty mysterious grins. It's because of his hair that looks like somebody's kid brother, dark blonde, clipped short, and so afflicted with cowlicks that he cannot really comb it. He sort of wets it down. Jake Pepper is a detective employed by the State Bureau of Investigation. We had first met each other through close mutual friend, another detective in a different state. In 1972, he wrote a letter saying he was working on a murder case, something that he thought might interest me. I telephoned him, and we talked for 3 hours. I was very interested in what he had to tell me, and he became alarmed when I suggested I travel out there and survey the situation myself. He said that would be premature and might endanger his investigation, but he promised to keep me informed. For the next 3 years, we exchanged telephone calls every month, the case developing along lines as intricate as a rat's maze seemed to have reached an impasse. Finally, I said, just let me come there and look around. So it was that I found myself one cold March night, sitting with Jake Pepper in his motel room on a wintry, wind-blown outskirts of this forlorn little western town. Actually, the room was pleasant, cozy. After all, off and on, it had been Jake's home for almost 5 years, and he had built shelves to display pictures of his family, his sons and grandchildren, and to hold hundreds of books, many of them concerning the Civil War, and all of them the selections of an intelligent man. He was partial to Dickens, Melville, Trollope, Mark Twain. Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, a glass of bourbon beside him. He had a chessboard spread before him. Absently, he shifted the chessmen about. Truman. The amazing thing is, nobody seems to know anything about this case. It has almost no publicity. Jake, there are reasons. I've never been able to put it into proper sequence. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Where shall we begin? From the beginning. Go over to the bureau, look in the bottom drawer, see that little cardboard box? Take a look at what's inside. What I found inside the box was a miniature coffin. It was a beautifully made object, carved with light balsa wood. It was undecorated, but when one opened the hinged lid, one discovered the coffin was not empty. It contained a photograph, a casual, candid snapshot of two middle-aged people, a man and a woman, crossing a street. It was not a pose picture. One sensed that the subjects were unaware that they were being photographed. That little coffin, I guess that's what you might call the beginning, and the picture? George Roberts and his wife, George and Amelia Roberts. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, of course, the first victims. He was a lawyer? He was a lawyer. And one morning, to be exact, the 10th of August, 1970, he got a present in the mail, that little coffin with the picture inside it. Roberts was a happy-go-lucky guy. He showed it to some people around the courthouse, and he acted like it was a joke. 1 month later, George and Amelia were two very dead people. How soon did you come on this case? Immediately. An hour after I found them, I was on my way here with 2 other agents from the Bureau. When we got here, the bodies were still in the car, and so were the snakes. That's something I'll never forget. Never. Go back. Describe it exactly. The Roberts had no children, no enemies either. Everybody liked them. Amelia worked for her husband. She was his secretary. They had only 1 car, and they always drove to work together. The morning it happened was hot, a sizzler. So I guess it must have been a surprise when they went out to the car and found all the windows were rolled up. Anyway, they each entered the car through separate doors, and as soon as they were inside, wham! A tangle of rattlesnakes hit them like lightning. We found 9 big rattlers inside their car. All of them had been injected with amphetamine. They were crazy. They bit the Robertsons everywhere, neck, arms, ears, cheeks, hands. Poor people. Their heads were huge and swollen like Halloween pumpkins painted green. They must have died almost immediately. I hope so. That's the one hope, I really hope. Rattlesnakes aren't that prevalent in this region, not rattlesnakes either. They must have been brought here. They were, from a snake farm in Nogales, Texas. But now it's the time to tell you I know that. Outside, crusts of snow laced the ground. Spring was a long way off. Of course, we didn't know if the Baxters ever got a coffin. I'm sure they did. It wouldn't have fit the pattern if they hadn't. But they never mentioned receiving a coffin, and we never found trace of it. Well, perhaps it got lost in the fire, but wasn't there someone with them, another couple? The Hogans from Tulsa. They were just friends of the Baxters, and we were passing through. The killer never meant to kill them. It was an accident. So what happened was the Baxters were building a fancy new house, but the only part of it that was really finished was the basement, and all the rest was still under construction. Roy Baxter was a well-to-do man. He could have afforded to rent this whole motel while his house was being built, but he chose to live in this underground basement, and the only entrance to it was through the trap door. But they couldn't have escaped through the trap door? Hell no. The arsonist, the murderer, had piled cement blocks on top of it. King Kong couldn't have budged it. But obviously there had to be some connection between the fire and the rattlesnakes. Well, that's easy to say now, but damned if I could make a connection. Of course, in a place this size, everybody more or less knows everybody else, at least by sight. But we could find nothing that linked them to the victims or any motivations. There was no reason, none that we could find, why anyone would want to kill any of those people. He studied the chessboard, he lit a pipe and sipped his bourbon. The victims, all of them, were strangers to me. I'd never heard of them until they were dead. But the next fellow was a friend of mine, Clem Anderson, second-generation Norwegian. He'd inherited a ranch from his father. A pretty nice spread. We'd gone to college together, and though he was a freshman when I was a senior, he married an old girlfriend of mine, a wonderful girl, the only girl I'd ever seen with lavender eyes, maybe amethyst. Sometimes, when I'd had a snootful, I used to talk about Amy and her amethyst eyes, and my wife didn't think it was funny. One night, he called me here at the hotel. He sounded funny. He said he had to see me right away. So I said I would come over. I thought he was drunk, but it wasn't that. He was scared. You know why? Santa Claus sent him a present. Thank you. They'll be right out.
Thank you all for being here. We're really, really glad you're here. Thank my pals here. Griffin, that was great. I was reminded, you shared that letter that Truman wrote to your dad, to Nick Dunne, and I read it, and it's an extraordinary letter, so surprising to have come from him, and yet, as we're going to get into this evening, when you start looking through the life and the work, you see how often Truman was galvanized emotionally by recognizing people who he felt were like him down underneath, whether it was Holly Golightly or Perry Smith or Nick at a certain point in his life or so many other characters he encountered. And it's just one of the fascinating things about him. Which brings us to the idea that here we are, centennial of Truman Capote's life and his birth. And not every writer draws a crowd at 100 years by any means. And so, yet here we are, each one of us for our own reasons, with our own connections. Here you are, interested. He's a figure who, whatever the reputation has been, nonetheless, arguably at a certain moment in the mid-'60s when In Cold Blood came out, he and Ernest Hemingway were the two most widely renowned American writers in the world. And then he died in 1984 at the age of 59, and the last decade of his life had been mostly with the exception of works like hand-carved coffins, mostly drug rehab facilities and loneliness and shame and regret of different kinds. And yet here he is still today, 40 years after his death. His books sell a couple 100,000 copies every year. His name remains in the culture. We're going to talk about that too. And the work, though, where does the work fit in this too? And yet somehow it has stood the test of our attention. So that's kind of why we're gathered here, is to dig into that, put our arms around it, have some fun with it, because Truman did have a lot of fun in his life. I will simply say, because what I want to ask my fellow panelists here to start is basically, why are we here, each one of us? What is the connection? Why were we so keen to be here? And I'll simply say, as Lucas alluded, my family story is that my father was Truman's lawyer for the last almost 20 years of his life, his friend, and also eventually his literary executor. And in 1994, at the behest of Truman's will, he founded the Truman Capote Literary Trust, which gives out, it's a philanthropic institution that gives out fellowships and grants for creative writing and for literary criticism. And there's a prize in the name of Newton Arvin, who was one of Truman's earliest serious lovers, professor of literature at Smith, who was eventually drummed out of his job for being homosexual. And that prize is given each year. And my stepmother, Louise Schwartz, is here. She now runs the trust, and I'm delighted that she's here for this event. So that I grew up with Truman when I was little, in the house all the time. I think it's safe to say that being Truman's lawyer was a 24/7 enterprise, truly. And he was in our house a lot. I have a story to tell a little later about that. But I have, in one sense or another, since I did become a writer, followed his path ever since. So I want to ask, Griffin told his story. I want to ask Jay and Sloane here, what is it about Capote that brings you here, that made you want to partake in this and to talk about him? And when did he first come into your life? Sure, Jay.
I was trying to think, Jonathan and I were in the WNYC yesterday, and I was asked a similar question, and I was trying to think of whether it was the writing or the persona that first caught my attention, because when I was growing up, Truman seemed to always be on TV, and it seemed like he and Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer were always in virtual fisticuffs on the Dick Cavett show or one of many talk shows. They came from a period where they were the three guys who made writing a kind of a public sport. And particularly in New York, these guys were essentially New Yorkers. And so on the one hand, I think Truman was just sort of always there. And he was such a name that even a relatively naive kid growing up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, knew who he was. But then once I decided I wanted to be a writer, Truman was one of the few people that I studied. I studied his prose, as I wanted to learn how to write, and it seemed to me that he was one of the great stylists of his time, of his generation. And so later, and I guess I should say that later, after 1984, when I published my first book, I became sort of a semi-public figure as a writer writing about New York, and Truman was one of the few role models out there. Whether he was a good one or not, I hesitate to say, but he was such a public figure. I mean, he he was famous, and not always for the right reasons, you know. I mean, there was, you know, right from the very moment that he published his rather dazzling first novel, there was the picture on the back cover of the book, which was just so provocative and in your face and kind of slightly gay, which you were not supposed to be back then. And so he's always, it seems to me he's always been there, but I really, you know, I like to think of him first as a writer, and I like to think of him as the great stylist of his generation, as Norman Mailer, not always a huge fan, pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, probably the short stories were first for me. I love The Grass Harp. I mean, I sort of went through a story. I kind of entered literature, all of it, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, all of it through short stories. That's my sort of chosen path. So Miriam, and then some of the letters came to me. There's a book called Too Brief a Treat, which I think had a reissue where Jerry Howard did it, which is hilarious, because like you said, he's the, you know, it's him, Hemingway, sort of Fitzgerald, Toni Morrison. I'm just trying to think of whose style gets copied in America in that century. But he's the fun one. And
Joan
letters.
Didion, I would say.
Joan, yes, of course. But yeah, in terms of the entire, that lady, yes. Yeah, but yes, of course, in terms of new journalism and Silent Spring and all that. But really, I felt like the letters I remember reading and feeling like this person who I admired so much was also so, had such an ego on him. Like, he talks about Miriam, the short story, in these letters, and he's like, oh, they ain't seen nothing yet, wait till they see the headless hawk. And he talks about, like, throwing up every morning, waiting for In Cold Blood to come out because it's so good. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And he was right.
He was an amazing figure. I mean, going back to the stories, I mean, since we started with hand-carved coffins, which was 1980, let's go back to where this fellow came from, because it is an amazing story of American self-creation, which is something he revisits, obviously in Breakfast at Tiffany's, but all the way through. And he has a terribly sad childhood, as many of you, I'm sure, know. His mother pays very little attention to him. His father is gone. He's shunted off from over to Monroeville, Alabama, to live with family relatives, all women. And his neighbor and becomes his childhood friend is Harper Lee.
Harper Lee.
And there are many who think that Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird is partly based on young Truman. And then Ida Bell in Truman's first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, which came out in 1948, is definitely has some Harper Lee in it. And then, of course, she famously accompanies him down to Holcomb, Kansas, when he first begins to look into the matter that became In Cold Blood. But he then moves north. He moves to New York City. He went to a couple of schools up here that we know, in Trinity and Dwight. He went to Greenwich and went to Greenwich High School for a bit. He graduated from high school from the Dwight School and then never went to college. He claimed it was because he knew he wanted to be a writer from the time he was 8 years old. And he began writing stories at 8 and carrying a dictionary around. And in high school, he would go home and write for several hours. He said, the way some people practice sports. He got a job for 2 years at the New Yorker, never got published there. He was a copy boy and then left. Some say he was fired. And then he's writing.
I like to say I was the first guy to get fired.
I was about to say, Jay's
I was going to say, Jay, you know, that's a Truman Capote honor badge to get, fired from the New Yorker. So for good reasons. And it's a great way to become a writer. But all along, he was writing these short stories. He won a Mademoiselle Prize at a very young age, which got the attention of Betted Cerf at Knopf. And then they sign up his first novel. So I think he once described his own career, this is around the late 50s, after Breakfast at Tiffany's, as having two careers. That there was the first 10 years, basically, the novels, the stories, and the journalistic writing in the New Yorker. The Muses Are Heard, we can talk about that, and other things, kind of leading up to Breakfast at Tiffany's and what the prose was like. And then there was, in his mind, a conscious change towards a different style and different ambitions. So if you think about those works and how they resonate today, and also the fact that from the very outset, he was a homosexual, Southern, tiny-looking, high-voiced writer who hid behind nothing. He was the one that chose the photograph. He posed for it. It was in windows all up and down Fifth Avenue, made him a star, but it was also deeply controversial.
Yeah. But, if you read Gerald Clark's wonderful biography of Truman, what you learned, since most of us weren't around at the beginning, was that he was kind of shameless in his self-presentation. He didn't pretend to be, he didn't try to be straight, unlike his lover, Newton Arvin. He didn't try to make his voice deeper. It was, it was kind of high and fluty and slightly absurd. But what really intrigues me about his biography is that he utterly charmed most people. I mean, 9 out of 10 people were just blown away in a good way by Truman. Humphrey Bogart said he was the most extraordinary person he'd ever met. I mean, Humphrey Bogart, of all people. After, by the way, being beaten at arm wrestling 3 times by Truman. I mean, but, I think it's unfortunate that the persona has sometimes overshadowed the work, but in the same time, we have to say that he was an extraordinary person, and that's part of, even those of us who weren't around then, just that's part of why we remember him.
He was also fearless and unabashed about who he was, which is why he could break down and earn the respect of someone like Alvin Dewey, or he could go into a prison, like a state prison, and to interview one of the killers. His name was Tex, I'm blanking on his last name, but he was there in the Manson gang. He had killed not the Tates, but before, serving life prison. A terrifying man. And he recorded the dialogue, and he just doesn't back down. And this man could have reached across and snapped his neck right there. And he confronts him and then wins him over right there, this cold killer. That's what made him a great journalist. He had, despite how he sounded, people...
Do that again.
Yeah,
I can talk like that very well.
sound like Daffy Duck.
Why?
Yeah, we just heard some.
Why do you think we're here? In other words, what accounts for and describes his literary reputation today?
Yeah.
And how much of that, in your minds, is based on the work itself, and how much of it is based on this extraordinary arc of rise and fall and answered prayers that his life actually was?
Well, let's first of all say that we don't think answered prayers exists.
That's
because
yes.
So
I mean,
that is accurate.
There's all kinds of speculation about whether Truman really was working for 12, 15 years on this book called Answered Prayers. 4 short stories were eventually published, which caused him great trouble and anguish in his life. And eventually, Random House published the 4 short stories as Answered Prayers. But I think this book was always in his mind. However, I think one of the reasons we're still talking about him is because of 2 books, Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. And those are his 2 masterpieces. I mean, obviously, Breakfast at Tiffany's is in a slightly minor key. But I also think we can't get away from the fact that, like Hemingway and like Fitzgerald, the life was part of the draw. Fitzgerald unfortunately didn't enjoy the fruits of this, but the myth of Fitzgerald, his drinking, his romance with Zelda, his life in Europe, all of these are a kind of layer of glamour, which to some extent encrusts The Great Gatsby and Tender is the Night. And the same is certainly true of Hemingway. The hunting, the fishing, the safaris. I mean, maybe those are losing some of their currency right now. But I think Truman likewise was a larger than life person, and that's the other reason that we still talk about him.
But the actual writing of it as well, I think it's actually bigger than, obviously there are all the American touchstones, the new journalism. I feel like there are segments of In Cold Blood. There's a bit, for instance, that I actually think of all the time. When he finally gets his mitts on Nancy's diary, on the Clutter Girl's diary. And he's describing it, and he says something, he says, as in every manifestation, he's describing the actual writing itself, as in every manifestation, she continued to tinker with her handwriting. And he talks about, as she was saying, is this Nancy, different colors, different loops, and it's like, it does 18 things at once that feels almost like Joycean, frankly, where it's just, it's this life cut short, but that language, as in every manifestation, is biblical. He could have said as in every variety, as in every entry, all that stuff, and there's so much that is reflective of the Bible, of who these people were, the sort of rhythm of that sentence, where you can reread that paragraph again and again, and I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say that it's like the last paragraph of James Joyce's The Dead. Like, there's almost like a mathematical nature to it. That is a shame. In some ways, it's great because it got this rocket fuel from his amazing personality and charming everyone. And then it also got overshadowed when there was a bit of a downfall.
It's really true. I think the style remains like diamond-like.
It's crazy.
I mean, it has not.
Yeah.
I reread Breakfast at Tiffany's recently and was amazed at the amount of melancholy in it. The movie obviously.
Yeah. By the way, if anybody has seen the movie and not read the book, you have to go back to the book because it's a much darker, wittier, more acidic.
You can leave now and go read
novella.
Yeah, and Mickey Rooney's not in the book.
Yeah, Mickey Rooney's not in the book, and George Papard isn't either. The narrator is not necessarily straight, and he's certainly not George Papard.
And he has a similar profession to her.
Yeah, and he's a gigolo.
Yeah. We're doing a separate symposium on George Papard. But, and actually, Truman he did not want Audrey Hepburn in that role. He wanted Marilyn
Monroe.
Who was probably another person he recognized as a Truman-like character. But the prose really is extraordinary. But then again, looking at In Cold Blood and going back to the beginning, how he changed and the risks he took. He starts in this Southern Gothic style. Right. He starts paring it down a lot as he gets towards Breakfast at Tiffany's. He's been experimenting with journalism in The New Yorker, a book that becomes The Muses Are Heard, which talk about a great story. He follows this U.S. theatrical troupe to the Soviet Union, the first ever exchange of, in the arts in 1956. And it's a black troupe.
They're doing Porgy and
Bess in the Soviet Union in 1956. And Truman writes a series of pieces in The New Yorker that becomes this book. So he is preparing the way to use the form of journalism in a different way. And he's looking for his subject. And it brings him to In Cold Blood. And you think about how he brought the prose it changes, but it's the same standard. And I'm struck by, I was rereading this old interview he gave to George Plimpton in the Paris Review in '66, and there's this exchange where he's recalling that Perry Smith, the killer who he obviously deeply identified with, some say fell in love with, got a story about that in a little while, but Perry kept saying, but why are you writing this book? What's the meaning of it? What does it mean? And Truman kept trying to explain to him that there was no particular moral meaning. He wasn't trying to change people's opinion of what had happened, that he wanted to create a work of art. And he was very honest about it to this person who kept saying, that's so ironic because I committed these crimes, but all I ever wanted to do was make a work of art.
Yeah.
And now these crimes are going to be a work of art. And so it's the kind of complexity that he had been looking for,
Yeah.
and that he finally found in this subject. But then there's the nature of the story itself. And I think we have to pause and dig into this, right? Because this is the fulcrum. This is the sort of linchpin around like the before and after in the life story. And so what In Cold Blood, he called it, the first nonfiction novel. What do you make of that statement today, and what influence do you think it remains, and where does that particular relationship with the truth, which would go on for the rest of his career, this dance with truth, how does that presage where we've come today in the culture and the literature? I mean, yeah.
It was certainly influential. I mean, Norman Mailer immediately wrote a couple of, not immediately, but he wrote a couple of nonfiction novels. Truman almost single-handedly created the new journalism, the idea that the techniques of fiction and literature could be applied to reporting and to nonfiction. And he had a host of followers in that regard, and he almost invented this genre. So in that regard, it was truly influential and almost revolutionary. And I think it remains so, because I think that the membrane between fiction and nonfiction is now more porous than it ever was before in Cold Blood.
When
He's
he would
not
say,
in Cold Blood.
what?
But it's interesting because he's not in it.
No?
Yeah, no.
That's what's so.
And that's what he was struggling with when he was writing In Cold Blood. He thought, I keep bringing myself into it. I got to keep myself out of it. And then he just embraced it and went, no, I'm in it. And then it became first person, and he was a character in his own, and that became what became so influential, in new journalism, where the journalist would be the observer, the narrator, and and break the form of the who, what, where, and why that we've been used to in traditional journalism.
He kept saying that the hardest thing for writing In Cold Blood, in a way, was keeping himself out of it,
Right.
and still making it coherent.
Yeah.
And it seems like an easy line, but then you get into the book and you realize so many things that he is telling about what happened are actually brought together from 4 or 6 or 8 different interviews, and all the sorts of pieces that would be required to contextualize what's going on and not have him there, and also to shade the meaning and the color. And when, asked about his thoughts on the new journalism, he made a distinction in his mind, of course, no loss of ego on this front, but that the people that the nonfiction novel requires people who, journalists who have superlative creative fiction skills, and there are very few of those. The implication was there are none. But, he was asked about Hiroshima by John Hersey, which was early,
Yeah.
and he just said that's pretty much pure journalism. As you said with Mailer, the impact was immediate,
Yeah.
because it's an extraordinary idea. I think then, the slippery slope of truth then, leads to, some years later, almost a decade later, and he's writing supposedly a Proustian novel, and he's completely lost the thread of where the author stands.
Well, it's libelous.
Versus the truth. It's libelous,
Yeah.
and it's self-destructive in the extreme.
John and I were asked an interesting question yesterday about whether he crossed a line as a fiction writer in these stories that make up answered prayers. And I think John is right that he just lost all sense of the line between the observer and the participant. The one that I remember best is La Côte Basque, which is
1975.
it's just glorified gossip, really, and that was certainly what his friends thought. I think he crossed the line as a friend. I don't know whether there are rules about what writers can and can't do in that regard. He personally said, "Look, they knew I was a novelist. They knew I was a writer. What did they think I was going to do with these stories that they were telling us and that they were telling me?" And he told the worst stories about some of these swans, some of these women that he had been cultivating for a good 10 years, really since 55, which is when he first met Babe Paley, and then started collecting these exquisite New York society women.
He wanted into that world. He wanted into all the worlds so much, and basically at a certain point he had done it. He'd done the grand world, he'd done the smart world, he'd done the literary world, and then you're in this place. And I keep going back to the ending of In Cold Blood, and how famously he had to wait to see if Dick and Perry were indeed going to be executed. And they had several stays of execution. And it's actually, I think, brilliantly dramatized by Phil Hoffman in the movie Capote. And he's back in New York, he's not visiting. He has developed, particularly with Perry, this extraordinarily complicated, intense relationship. And yet he needs them to die to finish his book. And you literally can't make this stuff up. I mean,
That's when he was throwing up in Switzerland.
That's right. And
he didn't want them to die, but they had to die, or he couldn't finish his book.
it reminds me of a story, which is one of the reasons I think I'm here, is my mother told me this story years ago, and I think she had been saving it until I was sort of in my teens. And it was probably 1967. And Truman used to come over to our house for dinner parties a lot. I obviously was like not really coherent. So at that age, and the doorbell rang. My mother hadn't even gotten dressed for dinner. I mean, it was an hour before dinner, and it was Truman, and he seemed incredibly upset, disheveled. And she brings him into the living room. She's like in her bathrobe or something, and she gets him a big drink and sits with him as time goes on and gets closer to the dinner. And he's just in a state. And all he would talk about was Perry Smith.
Wow.
And he began to sob, I mean, convulsively for 10 or 15 minutes. And she just said it was absolutely clear to her that he had been in love with him. I don't think the physical thing has much to do with it in this particular case at all, but that and then there was, of course, the betrayal, the knowing betrayal that's implicit in that. And of course, Graham Greene said, there's a splinter of ice in the heart of every writer. And here we are. Yeah.
But the funny thing was he could also go to parties and talk fairly cold-bloodedly about the fact that he couldn't finish the damn book unless these guys died. So,
right, he was using it as fodder for the other side.
Yeah.
You have a story, and I don't even know what it is about Truman, and I'm not leaving the stage to tell it.
Is this about Truman Capote? This is about Jim Henson, sorry. Yes, two.
Okay.
But I might be the only person on this stage who has no direct connection. One is a sort of, I think everyone on the stage does know this sort of apocryphal kind of appetizer story, which is actually not mine, but Tennessee Williams, which is they were in a restaurant
Griffin has a Tennessee.
He emailed me, well, this is
story.
an abbreviated one. They were, I don't know if it's the same one. Does it have to do with signatures?
No.
Wonderful. So he was visiting Tennessee Williams in a restaurant in Florida somewhere, and a woman recognized Truman and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm such a fan. Can you sign my menu?" He does it. She leaves, goes back with her husband, who's fairly drunk. The husband then goes ambling up to the table again and exposes himself and says, "Can you sign this?" And Truman goes, "Well, I don't know if I could sign it, but I could initial it." So that's one story that I've always known. And when I say always, not, whatever age it was appropriate. But the actual story that you don't know is very strange, which I'll try to do the land speed record for this so everybody can have their turn here. But basically, my boyfriend's grandmother was living in a boarding house in Atlanta in the early 50s. And I don't know what, because it's this event, I think I can just use the spoiler of who
You
the
mean
person...
grandmother?
Grandmother.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Daughter.
Whoops.
That's another
Whole
symposium.
other,
The next week.
a whole other event. Sorry, excuse me. Grandmother is living in a boarding house in Atlanta in the 50s. And she hangs out a lot on the roof where she smokes cigarettes. She's not talking to the other women. I don't know. She was very tall and blonde. I don't know. She's playing with the cats, and she befriends this guy who's living in the top floor, renting an apartment across the alleyway, which sounds very romantic, but he has a very high-pitched voice. And she's a little worried because it's Atlanta in the 50s. And I have no idea what he was doing in Atlanta. It's like the one southern city he has no connection to. Maybe I think Jack had some relatives in Atlanta.
Jack Dunphy, his partner.
Yeah. Anyway, so they talk for a few weeks. They become friendly. That's it. He leaves. Years later, she's watching, what was it, like Dick Cavett or something like that. And she comes in from the other room because she hears this voice that is so distinctive, as we've established. And she's like, "That's the guy." And I will tell you right now, her last name, I asked to see ID, is Golightly.
Really?
So he took the name, and when my boyfriend's mother was telling me about her mother, she kept saying during this story, she kept going, and my mother was a very proper woman. I'm like, okay, sure. And then I realized that with the kicker, it's not the character. It's just
so
the
interesting.
name.
Yeah, no,
That's a good one.
And it's a great name for Holly.
I mean, it's real. I had no idea. It's real.
And do you know what Holly's first name is, really?
It was called like Claudia.
Lily.
No, but-
terrible. It's something bad.
No, but she called herself Holiday Golightly,
Oh, that's right.
which was then
But the
short.
character's name was originally something turnip trucky.
Lulu May.
Is Lulu May and
Lulu May
and,
Burn-
and
Burn
Truman's
Cloud.
mother's name was Lily May.
Yeah,
it
Lily
was,
May.
she
Yeah.
wanted it more, I think, that fish out of water feeling.
Yeah.
Being in New York, Holly Golightly seemed so glamorous, which it is, even before he made it famous.
It's a great name, and he was really good with names too.
Yeah.
Also, the physical descriptions of the characters in
Amazing.
Breakfast at Tiffany's
Yeah.
are extraordinary, and I've just read them over and over again, hoping I would learn. So.
Speaking of physical descriptions, and a little less innocent than Sloane's story, both of you, I believe, were attacked or seduced in a very nice way, I'm sure, back in the day when it was all fine. But
I told you I had the less direct connection.
I sort of hate to speak of the end of Truman's life because it wasn't very pleasant, but I met him in the spring of 1984, the year that he died. He died in November, I believe, right? And I was at George Plimpton's house. George's house for many, many years, for several decades probably, was a center of literary New York. He'd have parties almost every week. Somebody was publishing a book, or there was a new issue of the magazine, or he just wanted to meet some girls, whatever. But I went there after I had published I was on the verge of publishing my first story in the Paris Review, and I met the most extraordinary people there, like Gay Talese, and William Styron, and Robert Stone, and so on. But one of the people I met was Truman Capote, who sort of lurched over to me and slobbered on me a little bit, and he convinced me to go into George's office, which was off the billiard room, by promising me some cocaine. And so off we went to George's office, and while I was trying to do his cocaine, he was trying to grope me vigorously. And but what I thought was sad about this story, because I could more than handle myself with Truman Capote, but it was very sad. He said, Jay, do you realize? He said, do you realize what the secret of writing is? And I said, no. And he said, this is it. He said, it's coke. You can just write all night on coke. And I just thought, I was only 28 years old at the time, but I already knew that wasn't the secret.
You knew it was Adderall?
Of life. And unfortunately, I had seen him on that terrible talk show.
Dick Cavett?
No, it was a local New York talk show that really kind of exposed him for someone with a really bad alcohol and drug habit. He went on this morning talk show in New York, having not slept the night before, and he was just a complete wreck. And unfortunately, that was the condition in which I found him. But that's why I like to read Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood.
Yes.
So I can remember why we are all here talking about Truman.
It is true. It is true. Griffin.
Oh, God. Well, mine's a little possibly redundant, but I had in New York, and when I was 19, I had a job as an assistant to an old movie star named Ruth Ford. She lived in the Dakota, and I would go there and write her fan mail for her and sign her pictures and send them off to the
Sunset
few
Boulevard.
people. Yeah, it was right out of Sunset Boulevard, I gotta say. And she had this very grand apartment, and she would give dinners for the most amazing people. And she had a butler who was from Thailand, and he would bring out Thai food. He eventually, when she died, he inherited the apartment. But anyway, this one particular dinner, and my job was to serve the alcohol. And I would stand where the bar was, and the table would be laid out before me. And this particular evening was Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, Henry Getzeller, who was that time running MoMA, and Dotson Rader, who was a young man who'd been also a novelist, who was much younger than Ruth, but they were lovers. And so my job was to bring the booze, and the Thai food was just, they put cigarettes out and no one touched it. They just wanted more booze. And I keep running up with more, freshen my drink, please. Hurried over. And then, I don't know, the handsy thing started happening. And Tennessee, I think, started it. He pinched my butt, and I went, oh! And like a little barmaid, and they thought that was hilarious. And then they'd all sort of pinch my ass as I was going around. And I'm still pouring the thing. And Ruth goes, Tennessee, she was from the South too. Tennessee, Truman, I think your fans, I think you much admire this boy's aunt. Her name's Joan Didion. And they went ashen. And Tennessee said, oh, young man, please come join us. And I sat between the two of them, and I had the greatest night. And I got to ask them, stuff about, talk to Tennessee about a streetcar, and I kind of reminded Truman, but he wasn't registering. Hey, how come he didn't invite Dad to the black and white ball? But it was an evening that started off a little iffy and just ended up as one of the most memorable times I ever had.
I think it's safe to say the writing life today is less exciting than it was back in the day. But we have a couple minutes before Molly's going to come on. But I just want to say, and I think we'll all have versions of this, but the last few weeks, I wanted to do this for my dad, really.
That's why we're here, because he wanted
He
wanted to mollify his dad.
Go home at Christmas.
Very elaborate.
And but I also, the pleasure of it has been going back into the work over the last few weeks, and some of the movies too, as everything. But I'll say it's hard to lay a glove on this guy on the best of his work. And we were talking about A Christmas Memory yesterday too.
Oh yeah.
Jay used to read it every year to his family, and it's a beautiful story.
At Christmas.
But the prose just seems, it hasn't dated. None of this is dated, and that's not typical for works from those years. And if you haven't gone back recently, I really urge you to do so. It's just alive, you know, and it has all different kinds of registers of human experience, the American experience, outsiders, transients, things that you don't expect. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Is there, this is a little bit hokey, but I think it might actually be kind of helpful, because obviously we've been talking about these major works. Are there any sort of minor things, like A Christmas Story is a good one?
Christmas Memory.
I
mean, Miriam is still a good story.
That you know, is a wonderful story. It's got that, it's like you can see the Southern Gothic in it.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
I think The Muses Are Heard is really just an amazing. The work he did for The New Yorker was fantastic, and seeing it, knowing that he's going to go on and do In Cold Blood is amazing. Yeah. There's a story called Shut a Final Door, which I think was his first O. Henry story. They're really, really great. So I think
Molly's here.
Sure.
Yeah,
I see her.
There she is.
So Molly's going to come and talk a bit and read a passage, in fact, from Breakfast at Tiffany's. So we're delighted.
Excellent.
Clap.
Hello. I know you three. We haven't met. Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm really happy to be here. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I had to be somewhere else before, and I'm a little overdressed, but I think Truman would like it, and I think it's very Holly Golightly. And I have to say a couple things. I feel like Truman has been literally a part of my life, almost my entire life, because the very first time on stage was in The Grass Harp.
Wow.
It was an adaptation of his, it was a story, right, novella.
Yeah, novella.
I didn't have any lines, but I was only 3 years old. I toddled on stage, and I was one of Baby Love's illegitimate children. But they did give me a name, which was Fig Newton, and my brother was Burma Shave. And then many years later, I just played his last friend, basically, Joanne Carson in The Swans. And now, I have one more connection to Truman Capote. In 1986, I was approached by the Truman Capote estate to do a remake of Breakfast at Tiffany's, because they didn't feel, I think you guys were talking about this, the movie, as fabulous and as iconic as it is, wasn't really what he wrote. But of course, I was like, there's no way I'm going to do that. I mean, how do you fill those shoes stylistically? But I kind of regret it, because I think it would have been fun. But here it is. I'm going to read you a little piece from Breakfast at Tiffany's. She kept her promise to Mr. Yunioshi, or I assume she did not ring his bell again, for in the next few days she started ringing mine. Sometimes at 2 in the morning, 3 and 4. She had no qualms at what hour she got me out of bed to push the buzzer that released the downstairs door. As I had few friends and none who would come around so late, I always knew that it was her. But on the first occasions of its happening, I went to my door, half expecting bad news, a telegram, and Miss Golightly would call up, "Sorry, darling, I forgot my key." Of course, we'd never met, though actually on the stairs in the street we often came face to face, but she seemed not quite to see me. She was never without dark glasses. She was always well-groomed. There was a consequential good taste in the plainness of her clothes, the blues and grays and lack of luster that made her, herself, shine so. One might have thought her a photographer's model, perhaps a young actress, except that it was obvious, judging from her hours, she hadn't time to be either. Now and then I ran across her outside her neighborhood. Once a visiting relative took me to 21, and there, at a superior table, surrounded by 4 men, none of them Mr. Arbeck, yet all of them interchangeable with them, was Miss Golightly, idly publicly combing her hair, and her expression, an unrealized yawn, put by example, a dampener on the excitement I felt over dining at so swanky a place. Another night, deep in the summer, the heat of my room sent me out into the streets. I walked down 3rd Avenue to 51st Street, and there was an antique store with an object in its window I admired, a palace of a birdcage, a mosque of minarets and bamboo rooms yearning to be filled with talkative parrots. But the price was $350. On the way home, I noticed a cab driver crowd gathered in front of P.J. Clark's saloon, apparently attracted there by a happy group of whiskey-eyed Australian Army officers baritoning Waltzing Matilda. As they sang, they took turns spin dancing a girl over the cobbles under the L, and the girl, Miss Golightly, to be sure, floated round in there, arms light as a scarf. But if Miss Golightly remained unconscious of my existence, except as a doorbell convenience, I became, through the summer, rather an authority on hers. I discovered from observing the trash basket outside her door that her regular reading consisted of tabloids and travel folders and astrological charts, and she smoked an esoteric cigarette called Picayunes, survived on cottage cheese and Melba toast, that her varied colored hair was somewhat self-induced. The same source made it evident that she received V-letters by the bale. They were always torn into strips like bookmarks. I used occasionally to pluck myself a bookmark in passing. Remember, and miss you, and rain, and please write, and damn, and goddamn were the words that recurred most often on these slips. Those, and lonesome, and love. Also, she had a cat, and she played the guitar. On days when the sun was strong, she would wash her hair, and together with the cat, a red tiger-striped Tom, sit out on the fire escape, thumbing a guitar while her hair dried. Whenever I heard the music, I would go stand quietly by my window. She played very well, and sometimes sang, too. Sang in the hoarse, breaking tones of a boy's adolescent voice. She knew all the show hits, Cole Porter and Kurt Weill, especially she liked the songs from Oklahoma, which were new that summer and everywhere. There were moments when she played songs that made you wonder where she had learned them, where indeed she came from. Harsh, tender, wandering tunes with words that smacked of piney woods or prairie. One went, don't want to sleep, don't want to die, just want to go a-traveling through the pastures of the sky. And this one seemed to gratify her the most, for often she continued it long after her hair had dried, after the sun had gone and there were lighted windows in the dusk. But our acquaintance did not make headway until September, an evening with the first ripple chills of autumn running through it. I'd been to a movie, come home, and gone to bed with a bourbon nightcap and the newest cinnamon. So much my idea of comfort that I couldn't understand a sense of unease that multiplied until I could hear my heart beating. It was a feeling I'd read about, written about, but never before experienced. The feeling of being watched, of someone in the room. Then an abrupt rapping at the window, a glimpse of ghostly gray. I spilled the bourbon. It was some little while before I could bring myself to open the window and ask Miss Golightly what she wanted. "I've got the most terrifying man downstairs," she said, stepping off the fire escape into the room. "I mean, he's sweet when he isn't drunk, but let him start lapping up the vino, and oh God, quel beast. If there's one thing I loathe, it's men who bite." She loosened a gray flannel robe off her shoulder to show me evidence of what happens if a man bites. The robe was all she was wearing. "I'm sorry if I frightened you, but when the beast got so tiresome, I just went out the window. I think he thinks I'm in the bathroom, not that I give a damn what he thinks. The hell with him. He'll get tired, he'll go to sleep. My God, he should. 8 martinis before dinner and enough wine to wash an elephant. Listen, you can throw me out if you want to. I've got a gull barging in on you like this, but that fire escape was damned icy and you look so cozy, like my brother Fred. We used to sleep 4 in a bed, and he was the only one that ever let me hug him on a cold night. By the way, do you mind if I call you Fred? She'd come completely into the room now, and she paused there staring at me. I'd never seen her before not wearing dark glasses, and it was obvious now that they were prescription lenses, for without them, her eyes had an assessing squint, like a jeweler's. They were large eyes, a little blue, a little green, dotted with bits of brown, very colored, like her hair. And like her hair, they gave out a lively, warm light. I suppose you think I'm very brazen or trefu or something. Not at all. She seemed disappointed. Yes, you do. Everybody does. I don't mind. It's useful. She sat down on one of the rickety red velvet chairs, curved her legs underneath her, and glanced around the room, her eyes puckering more pronouncedly. How can you bear it? It's a chamber of horrors. Oh, you get used to anything, I said, annoyed with myself, for actually I was proud of the place. I don't. I never get used to anything. Anybody that does, they just might as well be dead. Her dispraising eyes surveyed the room again. What do you do here all day? I motioned toward a table tall with books and paper. Write things. I thought writers were quite old. Of course, Sir Ryan isn't old. I met him at a party, and really, he isn't very old at all, in fact. She mused. If he'd give himself a closer shave. By the way, is Hemingway old? In his 40s, I should think. Oh, that's not bad. I can't get excited by a man until he's 42. I know this idiot girl who keeps telling me I ought to go to a head shrinker. She says I have a father complex, which is so much marred. I simply trained myself to like older men, and it was the smartest thing I ever did. How old is W. Somerset Mom? I'm not sure. 60-something? Oh, that's not bad. I've never been to bed with a writer. No, wait. Do you know Benny Shacklet? She frowned when I shook my head. That's funny. He's written an awful lot of radio stuff, but Kel Rat, tell me, are you a real writer? Well, it depends on what you mean by real. Well, darling, does anyone buy what you write? Not yet. I'm going to help you, she said. I can, too. Think of all the people I know who know people. I'm going to help you because you look like my brother Fred, only smaller. I haven't seen him since I was 14. That's when I left home, and he was already 6'2". My other brothers were more your size, runts. It was the peanut butter that made Fred so tall. Everybody thought it was Dottie, the way he gorged himself on peanut butter. He didn't care about anything in this world except horses and peanut butter. But he wasn't Dottie, just sweet and vague and terribly slow. He'd been in the 8th grade 3 years when I ran away. Oh, poor Fred. I wonder if the Army's generous with their peanut butter. Which reminds me, I'm starving. I pointed to a bowl of apples, at the same time asked her how and why she'd left home so young. She looked at me blankly and rubbed her nose as though it tickled, a gesture seen often repeated. I came to recognize it as a symbol that one was trespassing. Like many people with a bold fondness for volunteering intimate information, anything that suggested a direct question, a pinning down, put her on guard. She took a bite of apple and said, "Tell me something you've written, the story part." Well, that's one of the troubles. They're not the kind of stories you can tell. Too dirty? Well, maybe I'll let you read one sometime. Whiskey and apples go together. Fix me a drink, darling, then you can read me a story yourself. Very few authors, especially the unpublished, can resist an invitation to read aloud. I made us both a drink and, settling in a chair opposite, began to read to her, my voice a little shaky with a combination of stage fright and enthusiasm. It was a new story. I'd finished it the day before, and that inevitable sense of shortcoming had not had time to develop. It was about 2 women who share a house, school teachers, one of whom, when the other becomes engaged, spreads with anonymous notes a scandal that prevents the marriage. As I read, each glimpse I stole of Holly made my heart contract. She fidgeted. She picked apart the butts in an ashtray. She mooned over her fingernails as though longing for a file. Worse, when I did seem to have her interest, there was actually a telltale frost over her eyes, as if she were wondering whether to buy a pair of shoes she'd seen in some window. "Is that the end?" she asked, waking up. She floundered for something more to say. "Of course, I like dykes themselves. They don't scare me a bit, but stories about dykes bore the bejesus out of me. I just can't put myself in their shoes." "Well, really, darling," she said, because I was clearly puzzled. "If it's not about a couple of old bull dykes, what the hell is it about?" Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, guys. Thank you. And thanks to Truman Capote. Have a great night. Thanks.